Hi everyone and welcome back. This is Disability Saves the World with Dr. Fady Shinuda. I am Fady Shinuda. This podcast brings you insights from leading experts in disability and MAD studies from around the world. You'll hear about the research and work of disabled scholars, activists, artists, and our allies. You'll also get some insight into their lives, their favorite non-DS activities, hobbies, and adventures. Most importantly, you'll get to hear how they think disability can save the world. My name again is Fady Shinuda. I use he, him pronouns. I have a PhD in public health sciences, and I am currently a postdoc in London in the UK. I identify as a fat, disabled, cis man of color. If you don't know me, hopefully you'll get to know me over the course of the next few episodes. But for now, I want to jump into today's show. We are joined by Dr. Tobin LeBlanc Haley. Tobin, who uses she/her pronouns, is an assistant professor in community studies at Cape Breton University in Nova Scotia. Tobin is currently working on a community-based research project on homelessness on the rural-urban fringe with Dr. Laura Pinn. I'm so looking forward to speaking with Tobin about her work.
And we got to be ready. And I think disabled, queer, racialized, indigenous folk, poor folk are ready for that fight.
And her life outside of academia.
I love to run and listen to terrible 80s music.
And to ask her how she thinks disability can save the world. Hi, Tobin.
Hi, Fady.
Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me in this very strange time that we're in.
It is a very strange time. I am finally out of self-isolation, and so I'm now in a new place. I'm out of my sister's house and at my parents' house. I'm calling you all the way in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. How are things over there?
I'm actually in New Brunswick.
Oh, you're in New Brunswick, okay.
Which is it has a very long and complicated backstory that I won't bore anybody with. But yeah, I'm currently in New Brunswick, in my hometown of Fredericton.
Okay, well, thank you for coming on again, and I want to jump right into segment one, what I like to call inside the project, the research, the work, the art. And the first question is, how did you get involved in disability studies? How did it come about?
Yeah, this is by accident, and in a lot of ways. So I'm a MAD identified woman, and I'm a political scientist. So poli-sci, this is changing, I think, in a lot of ways, but poli-sci has not always traditionally been amazing at embracing disability or disability studies. And there's some exceptions. There's scholars like Michael Prince and Michael Orsini who are doing some really important work within poli-sci policy studies who do attend to disability and MAD studies. But by and large, it's a discipline that has not had disability on the periphery, let alone at the center of the work. And so, when I was studying as a political scientist, especially as a master's student, I was very much, my life as a MAD woman was very much separate from my work. And it wasn't until I started doing my PhD at York and was thinking about incorporating some of my own experiences, but also some of the frontline work that I've been doing into my research, and focusing on that time what I referred to as sort of mental health studies or critical mental health studies, that my supervisor got a hold of me and said, listen, I think you need to go over to the critical disability studies program here and talk to somebody. And so fortunately, my supervisor was really sort of aware and tuned in to some of the conversations that were going on. And so she sent me over, and I met Cherie and the rest, and we did a reading course together. He ended up in my committee, and the rest is sort of history. And that was sort of my foray into disability studies. But it was very much by accident.
So the first person you met in disability studies was Cherie. Wow,
yeah.
That's quite lucky.
I know. He was so nice, and I just wandered over, and I was like, "Hi, like, I'm Tobin, and I'm a PhD student. I think it was my second year. I'm a PhD student, and I was like, I don't know anything, and I'm writing about, like boarding homes and like critically. And I think he was like, okay, well, she's critical, but wow, she needs a lot of help. And I sort of, was very generous with his time and really introduced me to the world of critical disability studies and math studies. Changed my life.
Like, the supervisor came through. This is such a nice story.
My supervisor, knows what's up. It's why you work with critical feminist scholars.
Right, yeah.
Leah Bosco, in case anyone's listening.
Right. So I want to know, like, what is the kind of project or the topic that you're working on right now that you'd like to kind of talk about?
As a political scientist, and I really hope people won't hold this against me, but because you're like, oh, art, and I was like, oh yeah, I wish I had an artistic bone in my body. I wish I was expressing myself and my thoughts artistically. But as a political scientist, in a lot of ways, people use the word. Might not be the greatest way to phrase it, but the word gearhead. Right? Like I like policy, and most of my work is about how disabled, deaf, mad folk experience social policy.
Right.
And like what it means to actually live policy. What is like the embodied experience of social policy under neoliberalism? And so almost all of my work has to do with that. It's sort of, it's critical policy ethnography. Rather than doing like a top-down policy analysis, which has its place. What I'm interested in is what is the lived, sort of meaty, fleshy experience of living with social policy under neoliberalism as someone whose life is marked by disability and madness.
Right.
And so all of my work sort of sits there. I'm particularly interested in housing. One of the things I'm working on right now is a research project on homelessness on the rural-urban fringe. And I'm working with a colleague of mine, Dr. Laura Penn, out of the University of Guelph. And we previously had been working with a community organization called Services and Housing in the Province. It's a large nonprofit organization doing work in southwestern Ontario on something separate, on an OTF sort of program evaluation piece. And we developed these really close relationships with people who were living at the intersection of like socioeconomic poverty and housing precarity and homelessness, and who wanted to continue having that conversation and do some of that work. And so with Services and Housing in the Province, Laura and I came up with a project where we are going to be working with people to develop digital stories about what it means to live with homelessness and housing precarity outside of sort of the traditionally conceptualized urban space of homelessness, and outside of the traditionally conceptualized rural space of homelessness, sort of in this liminal space between the rural and the urban, or what's referred to in the literature as the rural-urban fringe, or the rough, and sort of exploring those experiences and providing people with a forum to elevate their experience, to talk about their experience, to say what it's like to live in that space and with those pressures. So I'm really excited about that. The idea is that it will also produce policy webinars and sort of a multi-stakeholder conference. And we're working really hard at this point, although of course everything's on hold because of COVID, but we're working hard to make sure that this is sort of a community engaged, community responsive project. So incorporating research participants and research partners in project governance, paid really well for their work, right, sort of, and practicing those politics that we hold so dear as well in these spaces. So it's really, we're very much in the early phases of this. We were supposed to be doing the workshop in June, but obviously that's not going to happen. So right now we're on hold. And just reminding everybody that they can't get evicted right now if they live in Ontario.
Exactly. I mean, it's really interesting to think of like the urban and the rural as like this, the urban rural fringe that you're talking about, the liminal space in between those where people are kind of ending up living. And I'm just wondering, is like a lot of what you're talking about also gentrification, like urban spaces becoming unlivable or people being totally pushed out, but then also rural spaces being inaccessible? Is that also part of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what we're finding, and again, sort of early days, is that there is, with the with the high cost of living in large urban spaces, and so in large municipalities, you're seeing a lot of folk moving to sort of the outer communities in and around those large metropolitan areas. So you're thinking about, like, if you think about Toronto, we're seeing people who are moving to places like Dufferin County, right, living in Shelburne, living in Orangeville, and the population in those spaces is growing really fast.
Right.
Very fast. So since the last census, let's see if I get this right, the population of Shelburne has increased by something like 30%.
Right.
That's wild. And in those spaces where people are already living, the infrastructure of the community really can't support that kind of quick population growth.
Yeah.
And so what is happening to people who are marginalized, what's happening to people who are poor, what's happening to people who are disabled, who are homeless, the cost of living is going up. Access to lower market rent is becoming more complicated. Land speculation is becoming an issue, right? So it's really, people are really struggling and are feeling the pressures of the increased cost of urban life in these smaller communities outside of the larger city centers. And so where previously people had been, had gone there from urban centers to sort of find like a more affordable place to live, now we're seeing, in some cases, we're seeing those pressures being translated. Right. And, we didn't set out with this project, and the project that came before it, we didn't necessarily set out to capture disability. Of course, it was one of the lenses that we were looking through. But with the first project that we did, about 75% of the folk that we were talking to who were experiencing homelessness and housing precarity in the rural urban fringe identified as disabled, right? And so it's having like a particular impact or a particular intersection with disability in these spaces. And so we're trying to really understand why that's happening, and how people are experiencing it. And what services that need to be developed, like what is a policy response and what is a community grounded policy response that can actually take this on.
I remember reading, this was a couple of years ago, something like people in our generation were trying to find housing, something like 5% or so ended up actually living in like Barrie, and as a way of like moving out of the urban space, finding affordable housing. But then the cost of houses in Barrie went up by like an astronomical amount. I don't know what the percentage was, but it was over 10 or 20%. Yeah. Right? It was, so it became like an unlivable space for people who are low income or marginalized, or who need specific like accessible housing. If it seems like we're finding. So I'm really interested in knowing like what theoretical approaches kind of underlie your work in addition to disability studies.
Yeah. So if, as a political scientist, if someone asked me to describe my theoretical framework, I would say that I do the feminist political economy of disability policy, which is boring. But it's not. It sounds really boring. But one of my main theoretical interventions is feminist political economy, and in particular the way in which social reproduction is theorized, right? So social reproduction being that daily and intergenerational labor sort of involved in reproducing people as well as social norms. And what I'm really interested in as a policy scholar is how social reproduction for disabled mad folk is being organized through social policy by the state. So how is the absolutely socially necessary daily intergenerational labor required in the reproduction of bodies and social norms being organized by and through the state in and around disabled people's lives, right? And what is the impact of that? Because we do advocate for more care work, more research, more funding for care, more services for care, but we also have to attend to what are the damaging normative ideas of disability and madness that are being communicated through those care networks. Right. And what are the long-term effects of that, right? How does it prop up violence against disabled people while also drawing on like heavily racialized and feminized underpaid care work? Right? And so what does that look like, and what does that mean for folk who are living at the intersection of disability and socioeconomic poverty? That's sort of like what I'm most interested in. And so I do use a social reproduction lens going in. And it's very much in keeping with a lot of the care work that's happening. Like care is sort of what we're all focused on at this moment. But I'm particularly interested in how social policy, how state policy is impacting the organization of disabled people's social reproduction and intervening in, like, through social policy, right? Because we need social policy in order to live.
Right.
People are dependent on social programs in order to survive, just like the basic, and they're not even getting the basic needs. So it's sort of like the most basic fundamental requirements. We are so dependent on the state's provisioning of social, or the goods and services necessary for social reproduction, that, you know, people are subjected to like the litanies of violence as a result. And it is through the provisioning of social reproduction that violence is enacted by the state.
Give us examples.
Okay, so like the most obvious example is that in order to get access to ODSP, for example, like the higher paying, quote unquote, slightly higher amount of welfare, you have to identify as disabled and subject to yourself to those really invasive medical, right, assessments.
Right.
Right. So that's sort of a very basic example of how this like violence is enacted. So you have to routinely identify as disabled, talk about yourself in terms of like biomedical language, and also subject yourself to sort of routinized assessment by the medical system. Which
has often been, and you're required to do that, like reassessment, right? We've seen ODSP come up with like new rules, or you know, people are kicked off of the you know, Wheel-Trans and have to get reassessed for Wheel-Trans, and all those kinds of like, somehow disability is both permanent but also fleeting in terms of like policy.
And I think we're going to see a real, I mean, who knows with COVID, but I had anticipated that we would see an increase in those sort of like you know, deeply disciplinary practices with the Auditor General's report on the value for money chapter on the section in that chapter on ODSP. So that very damning. I don't know if you saw the very damning report came out from the Auditor General
of
Ontario on ODSP, and it's a value for money audit. I'm putting that in quotes, so you can't see that. But that's what it's called. And one of the sections of that is an assessment of ODSP, and sort of the underlying message of this was that there are people on ODSP who don't need to be on ODSP, and that the government needs to do something to make sure that people who are accessing ODSP are, quote unquote, entitled to the benefit. And one of the major concerns that was raised was the assessment and reassessment of people's disability status, and that too many people were being deemed disabled for life and didn't have to go and have that disability assessment. So I do foresee an uptick in this particular example of this form of violence that people have to be subjected to just to get access to those most basic necessities.
Yeah, and we are going to see that you know, I think disability claims are going to increase exponentially.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, like, I think, you know, people think that COVID is like you recover 100% from COVID. And, you know, we're learning now, in fact, that people are going to have respiratory issues for potentially the rest of their lives. And, you know, there's all the mental health stuff that's going to come in response to this. And, I mean, essentially, the government has rolled out basic income, right? In terms of its new EI approach. And you're wondering about all the cancellations to basic income that happened here in Ontario, and whether, you know, even the $1 billion cut to public health, you know, whether those things are going to be something that we return to as like a fundamental way of restructuring our like welfare system, our care system. Yeah, and I'm sure your work and analysis will be an especially important part of that. So I want to talk about methodology, and your approach is community-based or it's community engaged. And you said you know, people in the community, people who are living homeless, are like on the projects, right? They're part of the decision-making bodies. They're in some case kind of co-researchers or co-developers. So I want to know, like, how did you and your partner get to that, decide that that's what you were going to do? And so far in the project, how has that been?
Yeah. So, I mean, methodologically, yeah, I would say my work is, critical policy ethnography. And so you can't really do critical policy ethnography without talking to people. And if you're going to talk to people, you have to do it in a way that is not only ethical in the ways that the academy demands us to be ethical, but ethical in keeping with, nothing about us without us and other rallying cries of disability studies. I would say that my commitment to doing community engaged work really came out of making a lot of mistakes.
Right.
And looking back on projects and being like, ooh, geez, like I wish I had done this a different way.
Yeah.
Being trained as a political scientist, there is still this very positivist, and I was trained by lefties and who pushed me, and that's why I have the capacity to like think critically about this and reflect and be like, ooh, wouldn't do that again. There's still this very positivist, streak that runs through the discipline, and it's there, and it is really like very much present, and always working against that and always trying to remain critical of how we do research and what it means to extract knowledge from people, right, rather than build knowledge with people together.
Yeah.
And so really it came from just like making a lot of mistakes, and meeting people who were doing and reading people who were doing better work than I was.
Right.
Reading Gigi Veronka, watching Eliza do her work, Eliza Taylor, sorry. Listening to my colleagues like MJ and Sona and you and Chelsea and Kim, people doing all this really, really lovely community engaged work, and kind of pausing and thinking, okay, like I really need to step up my game here. Like this is not, I'm community based, but not community engaged. And so how can I be community engaged going forward? Right. So when I came out of my PhD, I would say my work was community based.
Right.
Which is fine. I guess.
Especially in your PhD when community engaged is probably really challenging.
Yeah, but it should have been like fine, whatever. But lots of folk do it, right? So and I had, I've been so fortunate meeting folk like Lucy Costa, right? People who are really pushing the academy to get its shit together and do real community work.
Yeah.
And so I really just made like a lot of mistakes and have learned, or I'm learning, how to do real community engaged work and what that should look like. And I'm very fortunate to be working with Jade Olmaj and some other folk out of the University of Waterloo on one of the Investing in Justice projects that came out of the class action settlement from survivors of Huronia, Rideau, and Southwestern centers. And that's a very community engaged project that we're working on, where we're supporting survivors to be authors of their own books. So it's 2 edited volumes, but we're just supporting folk to tell their own stories. And so learning a lot through that. And then I would say that my research partner, Laura Pin, is probably more skilled than I am at some of this. And so we're really learning from each other. And so when we designed this project, which really it's kind of not much has happened, right? It's because we got a grant in January and then COVID. So we can't even recruit.
Right, yeah.
Right? We're just waiting for the money to be freed up so we can pay people, because we don't want to ask people to do labor until they can be fairly compensated for it. Yeah. And so we're just, we're waiting. But what we've done is we've built into the governance of the project the capacity to pay folk to be part of that, and making sure people are paid for that work, to be involved in organizing and recruiting and right.
And is that the distinction between
and stuff? Yeah.
And is that a distinction between community-based and community-engaged work? Is that people are paid for their participation, or what would you say is a distinction, an important one?
For me, and I learned a lot. colleague of mine who's at York, Ethel Tungohan, who does like amazing community engaged work, focuses on migrant labor, and migrant labor activism. And having read a lot of her work, I think that the distinction I would make, it is not just about paying people and making sure people are involved in project governance, but that the question arises from community, right? Like it's an expressed desire of community. And then all these other pieces too. Right. So that, yeah, of course people are paid just like we're paid.
Yeah.
Right. Of course people are involved in project governance just like we're involved in project governance. Of course lived expertise needs to be recognized the same way that academic expertise, arguably more importantly, academic expertise is recognized. Like all those pieces, but first and foremost, it must come from an expressed community desire.
Right. So essentially, like the thing that you find, right, what we call results or outcomes or impact or all those kind of fancy words, or we don't use any of those words, it will help the community, will benefit the community, is a question they wanted answered in the first place, right?
Yes, or was a process that they wanted to go through. Yeah. Right. So, right, that maybe outcome isn't as important.
Right. Yeah, of course.
Maybe like an exploration of this topic is what's most important at this particular stage, and that is what is expressed. Right. And of course, the reason I have a job is because I do this work. Like I get a huge benefit. Right. And I work at the university, I'm a professor. Of course, there's tons of power dynamics and you have to navigate all of that. And so I think fundamentally the question has to emerge from community, or at least a desire to do the project needs to come from community. And then sort of what the question is and the ownership over the project still has to reside in and with community, with academics and community members acting as sort of guiding forces to the project. And that's sort of where I'm at in my, I'm not going to say journey, that's a gross word, but that's where I'm at in my learning process.
Well, I hope COVID passes, I mean, for all of us, but I hope, that the community that you're working with can come back and the project can restart in some ways. And...
We'll find a way.
Yeah.
Like the money's there to pay people. So now we gotta find a way to get it done.
Exactly. All right, let's move into segment 2. I like to call this the middle or the liminal space. I want to ask you, who's your academic crush? Who is it that you just can't stop fawning over?
I think probably right now my academic crush, or the person that I'm sort of most enamored with, is Dr. Sammy Schaack.
Dr. Sammy Schaack, yeah.
Yeah. And I followed her on Twitter, and just the analysis is always there, the body positivity is always there, the queer analysis is there, it's all the critical race stuff is there, it's all there, feminism, this person embodies that and just lives it in this really rad way that is both very academically rigorous but also highly, highly accessible. Right, to everybody, and I think that is so rad.
Yeah, so. I think we all fell in love with Dr. Schaack when
she twerked with Lizzo.
When they danced with Lizzo, and it went wild, and then it blew up on Twitter and went viral, and then of course they wrote an incredible piece, right, of literature after. And I can't remember what the online resource was or what where it was published, but they wrote this piece of literature that was so great, and then of course they took on all the trolls and the haters, right? And it's just kind of incredible. And I think right now Dr. Schaack is also doing things like participating in dance Zoom parties at night, and also doing something called, I can't remember what they called it, but it's quarantine outfits.
Corn fashion. It's amazing.
It's so good, right? And I just feel I think my favorite dress so far of hers is it's this dress with all these middle fingers on it.
Oh,
and I was like, first of all, where did you get it? Second of all, does it come in sweater form?
Because I want one.
Because I want one, yeah. Yeah, I think we're all a fan, but that's a good one. No one's mentioned it yet.
Yeah, I think my favorite outfit so far has been like the mermaid-esque, like glitter top, pants, and I want to say like over sweater, but it's like shimmery.
Right.
I don't have good words for clothes, but it's like an overlayer. It's long.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say Dr. Schaack and her book Body Minds Reimagined, right?
Yeah.
Which I recommend everyone check it out, especially because speculative fiction right now, like it's I mean it's always relevant. It's always like a highly relevant intervention, and it's something that it took me a really long time to come around to. But you know, like we're living in wild, and people keep using the word unprecedented, which I hate, times, right? Like when more, like at what other point is like work on intersectionality and speculative fiction more relevant than it is like right now?
Yeah, I mean, we are living the movie Contagion, so it's like, yeah, so, and like people who've imagined a different kind of world, right? One that's potentially like accessible, like anti-racist, you know, anti-ableist, like all these things that we want for our future, right? Yeah, dive right in there. All
Exactly.
right, the next question in this segment is kind of like advice that you have for younger academics or students, maybe those who are currently making mistakes and want to get a little bit better. What would you say to them?
Just finish. Like I don't just like get out of the PhD program. No. I
Just
would
finish.
just fucking finish. And this is not like it took me a long time to get my PhD, right? Like I had a baby, I worked full time, like no judgment. This is not, but just finish if you can. What would my advice be? That's not like weird neoliberal job market advice, which everybody knows and like doesn't need to hear again, right? Like, yeah, finish, publish, get grants, blah, blah, blah. But be like the perfect neoliberal academic subject. I don't want to say that. I would say like sustain a hobby of some kind that gives you joy and gets you away from your like academic crap, right? And no, like reading really esoteric like fiction novels doesn't count. Like, I mean something that turns your brain into a totally different place. Right. That uses a completely different muscle, whether it's physical, intellectual, music, like whatever. Right? But find something else that can become your escape. You need that because, yeah, you absolutely need it.
And then do it, right? It's like find it
it
and practice it. Yeah, don't let it, whether it is an instrument or painting or sewing or riding a
yoga,
bike,
whatever.
Yeah.
Laying on your floor in a dark room, like screaming at the ceiling, doesn't matter. Right?
What part of the brain does that work?
I don't know. That might actually be academic. I would have that as my life. But I think, yeah, like I think really finding something that you love or making a commitment to sustain at least one thing in your life that has nothing to do with who you are as an academic.
Yeah.
Because we are so, like, we are like so, I mean, some people are better at this. I'm not. It becomes so much a part of our personality.
It does.
It becomes so much a part of our identity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And that can make you like a total wank puffin and like kind of an asshole. And like if you like sort of let that take center stage. And it can also suck you dry.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, at one point I was looking at like friends and stuff on Instagram, and I was like, people have hobbies, right? It's like this real thing that they like participate in, and like I need one of those, right?
And like which one?
Yeah, and I was like, what do I do? So, I started experimenting, right? I hemmed my own pants using a sewing machine. I took up swimming that I hadn't done in a really long time. I kind of and that's one of the ways that like I did find swimming in the end as like this thing that I really love doing, and yeah, so experiment. Experiment, find something. I really like that advice. I think that's really good.
Do something, and it can change. Like it will change.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, I can't swim at all now.
Yeah, right. Like I used to run marathons when I was a kid, and like I have a job, so I don't do that anymore. But I still run. Right? Like it's it can be whatever you want, but just do something that is different.
All right. So on to segment 3. We call this outside the project, the
Oh,
research, the
yeah.
work. Again, who is we? It's just me here. I want to ask you, who is the most famous person you've met, and what was that like?
So I have been practicing this answer. Turns out I haven't really met anyone famous worth noting ever in my life that is sort of universally known,
Okay.
except for George Bush Sr. But I'm
Okay.
not going to talk about that because I was like a little kid and I was in school in the States and like we had to like line up and shake his hand. But like that's not formative. That was just like I remember because the school made a big deal about it. So like that's it. Like that's the only one that I can and sort of access that everyone will know who it is. And like
Well,
it's
I
not a
think
great in terms of like our world. Right? I think the most famous person I've met, or the person that I was like most excited to meet, who's famous in our universe, is Simone Schmidt, or Fiverr. Do you know
oh,
who that is?
I do not.
Okay, big shout out to Simone. Simone is a musician, a Toronto-based folk musician, who wrote a album. Sure, we'll call it that. I like don't really know how to talk about these things in the contemporary moment, but wrote an album called Audible Songs for Rockwood, and it documents the experiences of women who were institutionalized in the Rockwood Asylum for the Criminally Insane in Kingston in the 1800s.
Whoa.
And Simone pieced together through like 3 years of research all of these like cases and then wrote songs about it.
That sounds amazing.
It's amazing. And Simone's like they are a rad person. Capitalist, like decolonization is at the front and center, but they're um, anti-racist. You know, they really strive to do all of the work that that we profess and try to do, but they live it in this really organic, like super rad way. And yeah, and so I cited one of their songs on this album in a paper I wrote, and they found out about it and asked to meet to talk about something sort of tangentially related. And so came to my office at Ryerson, and I was like, whoa. And so we actually get to sit and have like a chat. And so, yeah, I would say that's sort of the most famous person I've met who's worth like time.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
It's also nice that someone read your work.
I know.
Like
like
went
you're
to
the
the ref
one.
and like yeah, exactly. And went to the reference list.
I know. You're the one who read it. It's amazing. So yeah, so we met up and we talked about like eugenics and anti-capitalist politics, and yeah, it was really awesome.
Well, I'm really interested in finding their work and potentially have them on the podcast. That sounds
Oh
like
yeah,
that would
you
be
should.
great. Yeah. Okay, what obscure fact do you carry around and why? What is the thing that you kind of this thing that in a lull during a conversation you're like, did you know this about a particular topic?
Okay, so everyone has an individual tongue print, like a fingerprint.
What?
Yeah.
So my
So like
tongue is unique to myself and only
yes,
myself.
yes, like your thumb, but your
Oh my
tongue.
God, if Hoover only knew that it
I know.
was
But also like like I don't know, it's very it'll be interesting to see. Yeah, so our tongues are like unique.
Oh my God, I would have
That's
never.
literally the only thing I know. I don't know any other interesting facts.
I think that's a pretty interesting fact. I mean, we always think that the only part of like that we can identify ourselves with is like our fingerprints or, our dental records if
Ugh.
like we're burned to a crisp or something. But now that there's like a
Huh.
potential third piece of anatomy that can.
I know. But now I just like because what it always brings to mind to me is like how can we harness that for like accessible technology?
Oh, right.
Right,
That's
because
good.
like your thumb, like being able to, so like I always think about I always imagine people licking their phone when which is terrible, don't do that, especially in the middle of the pandemic, but like you put your thumb on your phone and it opens your phone, or you have like face
Yeah.
recognition and it opens your phone. So it always brings to mind people like licking the thumbprint thing on your phone. How can we harness that for like accessible technology? Can you just like stick out your tongue and then do it that way?
I like that better.
Rather than having to like put your finger and hold it on, if you have one, right, on a machine, or face recognition, which means you have to hold your phone steady.
Right.
Right? Can you just like stick out your tongue? Can that be like another one?
I mean, I went to surveillance and you went to access, and so that is way better.
Well, I mean, that's the other thing, right? It's like you have, people take you to the bank and they're like, stick out your tongue. Anyway.
Okay.
It's like
that.
Not very good.
I thought it was excellent.
I don't know, like flamingos are pink because they eat shrimp. I don't even know if that's true.
All right. I want to ask, what are you reading now? What is the book that you have on the nightstand?
Marrow, Thieves. I feel like everybody else right now. Have you read it?
I've read the first chapter and I didn't get past that. Sorry?
Did you have to put it down because it's so like acute right now?
No, I started this actually a long time ago when it was when there were discussions about it in like the Canada Reads when it was up for like an award and stuff, and I remember reading the first chapter and not getting into it. I think sometimes YA isn't for me, and but I hear people love it. Like
I wouldn't. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily. I know why it's classified as YA, but I don't even think about it in that way.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like it really transcends the traditional categories that we put around literature.
Right.
I find it very difficult to read right now, and like I'm a white privileged woman, and I'm saying that, so I think it really resonates. It's really resonating with the contemporary moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
I mean, I should try it again. There's like no reason why I shouldn't pick it up. Maybe after.
Like I think I was 5 or 6 chapters into it when this hit, so I was like, okay. Like I was already used to it and was already, really, really invested. So, but I do recommend people read it. I'm also reading to my daughter who's 4, A Boy Called Bat. Do you know about this series? This book?
A Boy Called Bat?
Yeah, A Boy Called Bat. It's I should go get it. In fact, I should have had it here and like prepped it. A Boy Called Bat is about a young boy who is autistic and whose mom is a veterinarian, and they adopt a baby skunk. Right? And it's about being a little kid and like wanting to keep a skunk, like a pet you can't keep.
Right.
And the autism is present in the book. Like this kid's autism is part of his, but it's done pretty well. Or so far, we're not done. It could get really weird and inspirationally. So like, no, but so far, they're doing a pretty good job of like, including autistic characters as just part of life, regular part of life.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting, and it teaches kids about autism, and it teaches kids about skunks, and it teaches kids about loss, and the family is divorced, like it's and so the kid travels back and forth between his parents' house, and it's a pretty good disability studies book. I think I would. So far, so good.
Thanks.
Unless the kid like overcomes something in the end, then I'll frantically text you and be like, take this down. so far so good.
Okay, we did talk about hobbies earlier, but I don't think you mentioned yours. So what is your hobby and how did you get started?
I love to run.
Yeah.
I love to run. I love to run and listen to terrible 80s music.
Okay.
Like the more terrible the better.
Right. So just like a lot of Vanilla Ice.
Like, a lot of like Whitesnake and like and Def Leppard and but better, like more quality stuff as well. But yeah, some pretty terrible 80s music. And then some good stuff like Queen. But yeah, and just like run and feel angry and sad and stressed about the state of the world. is
Yeah.
one of my hobbies.
Running does that. It like just like generates so much like movement, and you sometimes, yeah, it's just sometimes can be very emotional process.
Yeah, and I find it like a very good um, like way to get all of my feels out on the road. So I'm that person who runs and cries,
Right.
who, like runs and yells.
Right.
And now that we've moved to the woods, it's much easier to be the person who runs and cries and the person who runs and yells. Because in Toronto, because there's so many people around, it was a lot. You know, people were a lot less accepting of it in some ways. Um, but we're more irritated by it. Whereas here, if they see it, they get shocked. Whereas in Toronto, if they said, they're just like, oh, shut up. But here I sort of get to do it solo. So that's kind of nice. So that and baking, I bake a lot.
Right. Yeah. I
I
think
bake a
we're
lot of
all like, I mean, I've looked up how to make starter like probably, 6 times since
like your own
quarantine.
sourdough starter.
I 100% want to make my own sourdough
Do
starter, but
it.
like you have to feed the thing every day. I'm like, this is too much commitment.
I know. I was talking to actually a good friend of mine about that last night. Like, literally, we had a conversation about she and her wife are making their own sourdough starter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
No, I'm baking a lot.
that's great. Well, I want to end by asking you the seminal question. How do you think disability can save the world?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. I think disability is already saving the world. I think we're already doing it. Like, I think, if nothing else, one of the clearest examples I can think of is when this whole pandemic started. All of the people who are chronically ill, all of the folk who are disabled, who, as a result of a particular disability, have to be really careful about hand washing and coming into contact with others, and who is let into their homes. Right? Already have all of this knowledge and skill, and have been really generous about sharing it with us, and have also been really good about being like, everybody calm the fuck down. Right? Like, I've been doing this for a decade.
Yeah.
Right? Like, chill.
Yeah.
Right? And all the mad folk, myself included, being like, yeah, yes, we've been preparing for the worst case scenario for like a really long time.
Yeah.
And like, now it's here. And like I'm already ready. Like, the neural pathways for like this kind of like high pressure stress is something I've already experienced.
Right.
Right. And like, here's how I deal with it. For example, run around and yell, but like, whatever.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, and sort of the counter to the drive for neoliberal productivity in these really trying times, like, a lot of it's from the disability community. And people being like, no, like, it's okay if while you're trying to survive, you don't publish like 8 articles.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, it's okay. And so I think in those ways, disability is already saving the world. I think what's really important and what is really going to push us, and I'm a pessimist who always hopes that she's wrong. I'm like an optimistic pessimist. Is what comes next. Right? Like, I think disabled people, disabled scholars, mad folk, are really the skill set that we have developed is going to be very important, because we're seeing things like homeless people are being housed for the first time.
Yeah.
People are being provided with like a living, quote unquote, living wage, unless you're accessing welfare, and then you're just being forgotten. Right. So we're seeing some elements of the guaranteed income project. Right. We're seeing healthcare being extended in some countries to folk who are not permanent residents or citizens. Right? We're seeing a lot of the things that we've been asking for as progressives for a long time happening. And so what is going to happen when this all comes apart?
Right.
Because it will. The state and the capitalist class must be getting nervous. Like, they must be nervous that all of the cracks in the system are evident, not only to people like us, but to everybody.
Yeah.
Like, they have to be getting nervous. And what, like, post-COVID fascism is coming our way. Like, we were already living it, right? But what is this next phase that's coming, where all of these gains that have been made are going to be rolled back. And what does that look like? And I think there, the skills of disability, anti-racist, MAD, Indigenous organizers are going to be so crucial.
And I think one of the most concrete examples of that is like the simple, like the idea that that's been trending quite a bit, that we need healthcare workers as much as we need grocery clerks.
Yeah.
Right. We need the truck drivers as much as we need the nurses. Right. Like those kind of we haven't seen that before in a health crisis. People looking to grocery clerks as heroes.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And like reimagining of value for particular labor, right? Reimagining what's possible is very much happening now. And I think, a disability analysis is like a really important part of that, right? And hopefully, like you said, we're gonna take them to task if they try to go back, or
they will try to go back as soon as possible. They will try to go back.
Yeah, I
suspect. Perhaps not on the wage subsidies. Maybe those will kick around a little longer, right? And maybe some of the financial, like the direct income benefits, will stick around a little longer. But what happens? What's happening in Toronto, where they're putting, and in the UK, where they're putting homeless people, they're providing them with housing.
Yeah.
Right. Like what's going to happen? You kick people out?
Yeah.
Like, the answer is yes. And like, what is that going to look like?
Right.
What are the discursive justifications that we're going to see, and like how do we unpack those? And I think that what will the new explanatory frameworks for why that's happening emerge? Right. That not only are we saying, you see in Alabama, people with intellectual disabilities are considered less like deserving of a ventilator, for example. Right? And we're seeing explanatory frameworks that have always been there, drawn upon to justify why like a disabled person is like less human than an able-bodied 37-year-old white man.
Yeah.
Right? So we're already seeing that. So what are the discursive explanatory frameworks that are going to come forward when the state starts rolling back these emergency provisions that they've put forward? How are they going to justify it? Right? And we got to be ready. And I think disabled, queer, racialized, Indigenous folk, poor folk are ready for that fight.
Yeah.
Right? Because we've been having it forever. Right? And so those are the skill sets that I think are going to save us. Hopefully. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we'll tip into some sort of weird benevolent capitalism. That's gross. We don't want that. But but I think disability is already saving the world, and I think that those skills are going to be crucial in what comes next. Just essential.
Well, I don't think there's a better way to end than on that note.
There you go.
Tobin, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was great talking to you. I hope you and your family stay safe, and thank you again.
Thank you. This was such a lovely way to spend a couple of hours on a self-isolating snowy day.
All right. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Thanks again to Tobin for coming on the show today. Over the next few weeks, we'll be joined by other disability and math studies scholars, activists, and artists. Stay tuned. This podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by me, Fady Shinuda. Please get in touch by sending an email to disabilitysavestheworld@gmail.com. If you're interested to learn about me and my work, you can check out my website, fadyshinuda.com. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time on Disability Saves the World.